Welcome to Murderous America. Hey guys, welcome back to Murderous America. I'm Maya.
And I'm Oscar. What state are we in today, Maya?
Today we are in Mississippi. Can you spell that, Oscar?
MISSISS. No.
Okay, yeah. So we are in Mississippi today. This is an older case because, I like to tend to do those. So, should we get started?
Let's do it.
Philadelphia, Mississippi, June 21st, 1964. 3 members of the Congress of Racial Equality, or CORE, were driving through town, going back to the Council of Federated Organizations, or COFO, headquarters in Meridian. They had gone to Longdale, Mississippi to investigate a fire at the Mount Zion Methodist Church. Just a month earlier, one of the men had been there talking to the black congregation about setting up a freedom school.
What's a freedom school?
So a freedom school was a place where voting and civil rights activists would help black Americans, mainly in the South, prepare for literacy and comprehension tests that were required to be able to register to vote. In Mississippi, for example, you had to transcribe and interpret part of the Mississippi Constitution and then answer a few questions and write an essay about citizenship.
Mm-hmm.
But the interpretation of all of your answers were up to the officials grading it, who were always white. So if they didn't agree with you, they could just fail you.
So it's just always unfair.
Yeah. It really disenfranchised black Americans. The men were driving through Philadelphia at around 3 p.m. Earlier that day, when they left the COFO headquarters, they had told other workers there that if they were not back by 4, to start searching for them.
Mm-hmm.
As they passed the Philadelphia city limits, they get a flat tire. And they drove a little bit further to a fork in the street up ahead, with Deputy Sheriff Cecil Price following behind them the entire time.
Mm-hmm.
Once they stop, Deputy Price arrests them.
For what?
He said that the driver was going 65 miles per hour in a 35, and that the other 2 were just for an investigation. But their car was very recognizable. One of the men had been in that area for a long time. They were taken to the Philadelphia jail. Once there, Price told the trio that they had to wait for the justice of the peace to arrive before a fine could be set, even though fines for different things were hung up on the wall.
Mm-hmm.
So they could see what they needed to pay.
Yeah.
But he put them in the cell, and one of the men asked to make a phone call, but was denied the request. Around 4:45, workers at CORE, I know I said COFO earlier, it's kind of together.
Mm-hmm.
They were working together during this summer, but workers at CORE were worried about the men. And it was procedure to then call all of the jails and police departments in the area they were known to have been near.
Yeah.
Because civil rights activists, as you probably know, did get arrested a lot.
Yeah.
They called and heard nothing back. Minnie Herring, the wife of the Philadelphia jail jailer, claimed that there had never been a phone call made to the jail on that day. But phone records show that CORE called the jail around 5:30 p.m.
They hiding it.
A little after 10 p.m., Price returned to the jail without the justice of the peace and collected the speeding fine. And he told the trio to get out of the county.
How much was it?
$20.
So not bad now, but
Yeah, pretty.
a fortune back then.
Almost immediately after their release, Price began following them again.
Mm-hmm.
They left the city and passed a local store where they might have wanted to stop to use the phone, but the presence of a highway patrol car in the parking lot kept them away.
Mm-hmm.
Eventually, on Road 492, Price caught up to the men and pulled them over once again onto a secluded intersection. Only this time, once they were pulled over, another car full of men also pulled up. But the men weren't police officers or normal citizens. They were part of the White Knights of the Ku Klux Klan, a branch of the KKK. And it had become an angry mob. Led by Alton Roberts and James Jordan, the mob grabbed the 3 men. And there's some different stories about that they grabbed them, stuffed them into their cars, and took them farther down to a secluded area.
Mm-hmm.
Or if this intersection was secluded enough. I saw sources saying both.
Mm-hmm.
But either way, 2 of the men were shot point blank by Roberts, while Jordan shot the 3rd man in the stomach, and Roberts finished the man off with a shot to the head.
Holy shit.
These men were James Chaney, Michael Schwerner, and Andrew Goodman. Schwerner and Goodman were 2 white Jewish activists from New York, while Chaney was a black activist from Meridian, Mississippi. After the 3 men were shot, they were loaded into their station wagon and driven to the farm of Olin Burridge, one of the conspirators. At the farm, men were already there ready to bury the bodies. And a later autopsy of Goodman's body found traces of red clay in his lungs and fist, hinting that he could have been buried alive. It's not confirmed. Some of the men did say that they were already dead when they buried him, but that is just an interesting fact. And Chaney's body had also been beaten and castrated before burial. Let's talk a little bit more about the Freedom Summer. During the summer of 1964, hundreds of college students and activists from different states and civil rights groups flooded Mississippi to help get Black Americans registered to vote, but also to draw national attention to the injustices and oppression of Black Mississippi citizens when they tried to vote. The Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, or SNCC, had already been working on voter registration in Mississippi since 1961, but unlike the peaceful protests in Birmingham and Montgomery, Alabama at the time, the segregationists in rural Mississippi made it almost impossible for anything to happen. At this time, Mississippi was probably, if not the worst, one of the worst
places to be.
Yeah. And the Freedom Summer campaign had only just started when Cheney, Schwerner, and Goodman went missing. About a week or so before his murder, Schwerner had been in Meriden, Mississippi, helping organize a freedom school at the Mount Zion Methodist Church. White segregationists were very angry about this and torched the church, burning it to the ground. And they had hoped that Schwerner was there, so Schwerner kind of became an enemy to them. That is why Price knew his car and who he was. But so now I think we should dive into the lives of the three men. James Cheney was born on May 30th, 1943 in Meridian, Mississippi, the eldest of 5 children to Fannie Lee and Ben Cheney Sr. Cheney went to St. Joseph Catholic Church for the first 9 years of school. When he was 15, he and a friend even made their own NAACP paper badges that they wore to school and around town to show their support of the movement. They were both suspended for 1 week because the principal worried about backlash from the all-white school board. Cheney was always an activist in some way, but in 1962 he officially joined the civil rights movement. He participated in 2 freedom rides, one from Tennessee to Greenville, Mississippi, and one from Greenville to Meridian. Freedom rides were a form of peaceful protest used by civil rights activists throughout the South to protest segregated bus terminals. Cheney and his younger brother Ben also participated in other protests as well, and in late 1963, Cheney started volunteering for CORE. As a volunteer, he helped organize voter registration classes and brought other CORE volunteers to churches in the area to meet with their leaders in hopes of setting up some sort of freedom school. Michael Schwerner was born on November 6, 1939, in Pelham, New York. Michael was the youngest of 2 kids to Ann and Nathan Schwerner. Ann was a biology teacher, and Nathan was a lawyer and civil liberties activist. His brother Stephen told the Associated Press that, quote, "We learned at an early age people were equal and that segregation was wrong," end quote. Stephen also says that when they were younger, their parents tried to make sure that they knew nobody was better than anyone else. They would go to Yankees games and Negro League baseball games and see white and black musicians. So they really tried to make it so that their kids knew that there was nothing different between them. Michael began his college career at Michigan State University, wanting to become a vet, but eventually he transferred to Cornell University and changed his major to rural sociology. After graduation, he went to Columbia University for graduate school and attended the School of Social Work there. In 1962, he married Rita Levant, and she was also very interested in the civil rights movement, and eventually both of them started working with CORE at the Lower East Side Manhattan branch. In 1963, Schwerner worked with other activists to try to desegregate an amusement park in Maryland, which is pretty cool. Not long after, the couple were recruited to join the National CORE movement and sent to Meridian, Mississippi, where they met Cheney and became the first white activist from CORE to be assigned somewhere outside of Jackson, the capital of Mississippi. Rita had been in Ohio training new CORE members when the news of the disappearance broke. Lastly, Andrew Goodman was born on November 23, 1943, in New York City. He was the middle of 3 children to Robert and Carolyn Goodman. Robert was a civil engineer and a writer, and Carolyn was a social activist and psychologist. He also grew up in a racially diverse neighborhood. In 1958, at the age of 14, Goodman traveled to Washington, D.C. for the Youth March for Integrated Schools. Then a year later, he moved to a small coal mining town in West Virginia with one of his friends and urged the governor to do something about the poor working conditions for the miners. So he was all about it. When he was 17, he went to Europe to learn more about the impact that larger agribusiness leaves on smaller farmers.
This kid was ahead of the curve.
He was, and he also participated in a sit-in at Woolworth's store in New York. And the sit-in was to protest against the establishment's segregationist rules and policies. Goodman attended the Walden School in Manhattan for his whole life, and he was involved in the theater department. While in high school, he even arranged for Jackie Robinson from the Brooklyn Dodgers, who was also his neighbor, to speak at the school. After graduating in 1961, he attended the University of Wisconsin-Madison in the honors program as a theater major.
Wisconsin.
Although he left the school after only one semester due to contracting pneumonia, he went back to New York to get better. But while he was there, he also eventually was cast in an off-Broadway production of The Chief Thing. So he was still doing his theater things.
He was just doing his thing.
He's really cool. Once he got better, Goodman enrolled in Queens College and majored in anthropology. And while he was there, he met and became friends with Paul Simon from Simon and Garfunkel.
Oh my God.
During the spring of his junior year, so 1964, Goodman attended a talk by the head of New York's NAACP branch, Aaron Henry, and Henry and his colleague Fannie Lou Hammer were trying to recruit students to join them in their Freedom Summer Project.
Mm-hmm.
In June of that year, Goodman went to Ohio to teach at a core training session where he met the Schwerners and Cheney. They all trained hundreds of volunteers, and a lot of the training actually focused on dealing with the racism and violence that they would encounter on their missions.
Mm-hmm.
During that training, Schwerner heard that there had been a fire at the Mount Zion Methodist Church, which, like I said earlier, he had just helped set up a freedom school at.
Mm-hmm.
So on June 20th, the trio left to go investigate.
Yeah.
After burying the bodies, the KKK members had to figure out what to do with the core station wagon. They talked it out for a bit, and at around 1 a.m. on June 22nd, one of the Klansmen was tasked with driving the station wagon to a swampy area off of Highway 21 and set it on fire.
Damn.
After their men were reported missing, President Lyndon Johnson called the FBI director, J. Edgar Hoover, to get involved in the search. At this time, Mississippi was the only state without a central FBI office. So, the first agents on the scene came from New Orleans.
Ooh.
A preliminary search started but was amped up later that night by U.S. Attorney General Robert Kennedy.
The Kennedy?
Yes, JFK's brother. His son, if you listened to our Connecticut episode about Martha Moxley, his son is the person who has been trying to say that his cousin, Michael Skakel, is innocent.
Mm-hmm.
So, over the next 2 days, 200 FBI agents would make their way to Mississippi. On June 23rd, the station wagon was found abandoned and burned. Investigators now knew that they weren't trying to rescue the men anymore, just find them.
Mm-hmm.
Into July, as agents searched throughout the state, there was still no trace of the trio. They did, however, discover the bodies of 8 African-American men. One of the men was wearing a Corps t-shirt, and so the assumptions are that most, if not all of the men, had been a part of the civil rights movement in one way or another.
Yeah.
During the investigation, Rita Schwerner, the widow now, made this statement, quote, "The slaying of a Negro in Mississippi is not news. It is only because my husband and Andrew Goodman were white that the national alarm has been sounded." Calling out the injustice that faced black citizens at the time, she also went on to say that if it was just Cheney that had been missing, this wouldn't have been news at all.
No one would have cared.
After 44 days of searching for the men, the FBI got a tip from someone only identified as Mr. X, telling them where they could find the bodies. And on August 4th, the bodies of Cheney, Schwerner, and Goodman were found. There's also another story saying that the FBI enlisted the help of Mafia Captain Gregory Scarpa.
Oh, snap.
Because Scarpa could use certain tactics that the FBI couldn't.
Brute force.
To try to figure this out. And what's interesting is the FBI, they've never confirmed it, but they've also never denied this.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm not trying to be a conspiracy theorist, but that is very interesting to think about. So throughout the remainder of the summer and beginning of fall, the FBI continued to investigate the murders. In October, the state of Mississippi refused to arrest anyone in the connection to the murder.
Why?
Because Mississippi was very racist.
Mm-hmm.
So the governor and the state said that there was not enough evidence to try anyone in the murder, but really, he didn't even want the FBI to come. He didn't want anything. He didn't want to look for these men at all.
Yeah.
But in November of 1964, the FBI accused 18 men of conspiring to violate the victim's civil rights.
18?
Yeah.
Why can't the FBI try to do something about it?
So violating a person's civil rights is a federal crime.
Yeah.
And a murder is usually only a federal crime if it crosses state lines in some way or another. So this was just up to Mississippi. But since there was the federal aspect of the civil rights, the FBI could accuse and try these men on that, but they couldn't do anything about the murder charges.
Yeah.
On December 4th, the FBI indicted and arrested the individuals involved in the crime. I won't name all of the people, but some of the men included were Neshoba County Sheriff Lawrence Rainey, Baptist preacher Edgar Ray Killen, White Knights co-founder and Imperial Wizard, which I guess is what they call the heads, Samuel Bowers, Deputy Sheriff Cecil Price, and more.
Damn.
In January 1965, a federal grand jury indicted the 18 men on charges of conspiring to violate the victims' civil rights. But Judge William Cox dismissed the charges on everyone except Sheriff Rainey and Deputy Price because he believed that the law only covered law enforcement in this sort of case. The prosecution obviously tried to appeal that decision, and in 1966, the Supreme Court ruled that the law applied to everybody.
Dang.
So now it's February 1967.
Mm-hmm.
It's almost been 3 years, and another grand jury indicted all 18 men once again. And the trial would begin in October, and Cox would still be presiding as the judge.
That's fishy.
So a little more about Cox. During his stint as the judge of the Southern District of Mississippi, big title, he was appointed by JFK, Cox had been a known segregationist.
Mm-hmm.
Once, New York Senator Jacob Javits and New Jersey Representative Peter Rodino tried to call for his impeachment after he made this statement during a hearing on voter discrimination. He said, quote, "I don't know who is telling these Negroes they can push people around just by getting into a line and acting like a bunch of chimpanzees."
That's crazy.
End quote. By all accounts, Cox was going to be unbiased during this trial, which obviously seems unbelievable.
Yeah, not gonna happen.
But after the defense attorney tried questioning a witness, asking about Schwerner being involved in a plot to rape white women during the Freedom Summer, Cox stopped the attorney and said the question was improper and was, quote, "not going to allow a farce to be made of this trial," end quote. So he was, I'm not saying he was a good person, but he was at least trying to make this trial somewhat fair.
That's true, yeah.
Prosecutor John Doerr believes that that statement was a true turning point for justice in the courtroom.
Mm-hmm.
Going back to 1964 for a second, two men by the names of Horace Barnett and James Jordan, who we mentioned earlier, agreed to cooperate with the FBI, and they confessed to what had happened the night of the murder.
Mm-hmm.
The confessions were read, and Jordan testified. Now, Jordan's testimony and his confession was kind of a little all over the place. I will link it in the show notes if anyone really wants to read the entire FBI's case file.
Mm-hmm.
So Jordan's testimony was probably the most crucial piece of evidence for the prosecution due to his narrative of the events on the night of June 21st.
Yeah.
He testified that Edgar Killen, if you remember him from before,
Yeah.
he was the preacher, was the one who truly planned the attack. And during a Klan meeting earlier that day, he said, quote, "2 or 3 of those civil rights workers were locked up and they needed their rear ends tore up," end quote. He also claimed that prior to Killen's plan being made, that the co-founder of the White Knights, Samuel Bowers, had told them that they were allowed to do anything they saw fit to deal with Schwerner. They saw him as a threat. Like, why would this white man be trying to help these?
A traitor, basically.
Yeah. Also, he said that
Sam Bowers, who was the head of the Mississippi Ku Klux Klan, gave the Meridian chapter permission to kill Mickey, who was really hated because he was considered a race traitor.
So there's Stephen Schwerner kind of just re-saying what I said, but I thought it was more important to hear it from him.
Yeah.
The confessions also stated that Price had contacted Killen, letting him know that he had arrested the trio. From there, Killen gathered the group of White Knights and set up their cars on the edge of town. Now, they did have 2 cars. One of them broke down when they were trying to leave.
Mm-hmm.
So 2 of the men from that car got in the other car and made their way and left one man with that other car.
Mm-hmm.
At the end of the trial, 7 of the 18 suspects were found guilty.
Only 7?
And surprisingly, Edgar Killen was not found guilty.
Dang.
Only 7 because some of the jury couldn't agree.
Mm-hmm.
And also, they didn't think there was enough evidence for some of them. They still tried them all, but...
Yeah.
But so out of those 7, Price, Bowers, and Rainey were among them.
Mm-hmm. Good.
Each of the 7 men unsuccessfully fought for appeals for the next 3 years.
For 3? Dang.
They
don't want to give up.
Yeah. In 1970, they all finally were in jail, and all of them had received sentences between 3 and 10 years.
3 so little.
But once they were in, none of them served more than 6.
Years?
Yeah. Although this is obviously a huge tragedy, there was a lot of good progress made in the civil rights movement due to Cheney, Schwerner, and Goodman.
Mm-hmm.
Not long after, President Johnson signed into effect the Civil Rights Act of 1964. The act officially ended segregation in public spaces, so places like restaurants, hotels, sports venues, and movie theaters.
Mm-hmm.
It also banned employment discrimination based on race, gender, religion, and national origin.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of people do believe that the urgency to get this act through Congress and to the president was partially due to all of the national attention around all of this. Then in 1965, Congress passed the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which was what the Freedom Summer was all about. It's also important to note that, like I mentioned, Rita Schwerner said before, there were so many other people who died because they were trying to help end voter discrimination and just help civil rights in general that don't get mentioned. So that's also really important. It's estimated that about 1,062 activists were arrested during the summer. 80 were beaten, and 30 black businesses or homes were burned or bombed, and the same with 37 churches. And this was just in Mississippi. But none of this stopped the activists, and the Freedom Summer plans continued throughout the summer, and it helped so many people register to vote.
Nice.
So it still had some positive outcomes.
Yeah.
But before we go, we still have a little more to talk about.
Ooh.
Now we're going to talk briefly about a journalist named Jerry Mitchell. Mitchell worked for the Jackson Clarion-Ledger. In 1998, he published a few excerpts from an interview with Samuel Bowers, if you don't remember, the co-founder of the White Knights.
Yeah.
One of those excerpts read, quote, "I was quite delighted to be convicted and have the main instigator of the entire affair walk out of the courtroom a free man, which everybody, including the trial judge and the prosecutors and everybody else, knows that happened."
Dang.
And this was obviously about Edgar Killen.
Yeah.
In 2004, a teacher named Barry Bradford from Illinois reached out to Mitchell. He and 3 of his students were working on a documentary for a National History Day contest. With Mitchell's help, the documentary shed a new light on evidence and gave compelling reasons to reopen the case, specifically against Killen. Bradford even included an interview with Killen, which I don't exactly know how he got, but that ultimately led the state to reopen the investigation. Mitchell was also able to identify Mr. X, the man who called in the tip about where the bodies were, as Maynard King, a Mississippi Highway Patrol officer.
Dang.
He had died in 1966, though, so there's no more information about that.
Yeah.
All of this new evidence brought the case to national attention once again. And on the 40th anniversary of the murders, more than 1,500 people, including the governor of Mississippi at the time, Haley Barbour, to call for their case to be reopened. So it was reopened. On January 6th, 2005, a grand jury in Neshoba County, Mississippi, indicted Edgar Ray Killen on 3 counts of murder. I forgot to mention earlier that in the trial, when he wasn't convicted, there was one juror who said that they couldn't convict him because they could never convict a preacher.
Pathetic.
Anyways, this was the first and last time anyone would be tried for the murders due to lack of evidence or death. And Rita Schwerner also testified in the trial. On June 21st, Killen was found guilty on 3 counts of manslaughter. Killen, who was 80 years old at the time, was given 3 consecutive 20-year sentences.
He didn't live past 6, I bet.
Well, so basically a life sentence.
Yeah.
In 2007, he tried to appeal the decision, stating that in 1964, he would not have been convicted due to the evidence presented. But his appeal was rejected.
Good.
In June 2016, the Mississippi Attorney General stated that there would be no further investigations into the Freedom Summer murders because, quote, "the evidence had been degraded by memory over time, and so there are no individuals that are living now that we can make a case on at this point," end quote. So then Killen died in prison at the age of 92 on January 12th, 2018. So he was in there for a while.
Yeah.
In the aftermath of the men's deaths, each of their families started something to honor each member.
Yeah.
With help from the Goodman and Schwerner families, the Cheneys moved to New York following their son's funeral, but most of it was due to threats they were facing in the area. Both families also helped their son Ben get into a really good private school. Still talking about Ben, in 1969, Ben also joined the Black Panther Party in the Black Liberation Army. But while in Florida in 1970, with 2 friends, the friends of his murdered 3 white men. I couldn't find out why or anything, but he was also arrested and charged with the crimes. He served 13 years in prison, but once he got on parole, he founded the James Earl Cheney Foundation, which focuses on protecting all Americans' constitutional rights. Schwerner's brother, Stephen, plans to never let this story die, and as a professor, he has taught many classes on civil rights and makes sure that this will always be talked about.
Good for him.
In Schwerner's hometown, there is also a street named after him, along with many other memorials for him, Goodman, and Cheney across the country.
That's very good.
His wife, Rita, after all of this, she went to law school and became a lawyer, and she also to this day still talks about civil rights movements. And in 1966, Goodman's parents created the Andrew Goodman Foundation for the purpose of carrying on Goodman's mission in life, civil rights. His mother held a 25th anniversary memorial in 1979 that took place at the St. John the Divine Church in New York City. 10,000 people attended, some of those even being Maya Angelou, governor at the time Mario Cuomo, and Robert F. Kennedy Jr. And in 2014, President Barack Obama posthumously awarded all three men with the Presidential Medal of Freedom. Slay. So that is the case of the Freedom Summer murders.
What a crazy case, which had a lot of impact later on.
This case was pretty different from what we usually do, but I thought it was interesting. I thought it was important.
Very cool case.
I also think it's really cool that obviously she was grieving, but Rita Schwerner still made a point to talk about how privileged she was and her husband was.
Yeah.
And how none of that would have happened if they were black. I think that's really important. And she still urged them to do something about the missing black activists.
Yeah.
So what do you think, Oscar, about the one juror I mentioned earlier who said that they could never convict a preacher?
That's just such a dumb excuse. You can't really be using that. You can't put religion into this. From full on killing a man.
I also think it's crazy that it's estimated that 21 men, if not more, were involved with this, but they only
convicted 7,
even tried 18. What I also find interesting is that Johnson immediately sent the FBI. He talked to J. Edgar Hoover, and Hoover wasn't even convinced about sending anybody right away.
Yeah.
But Johnson was like, no, we have to do it, which I think is really interesting. That's all I have for you, Oscar. You have any questions, comments, concerns?
Absolutely none.
So thank you all for listening. See you next week.
Thank you.
Bye.
Adios.